This is the second lecture in Part 3 of our lecture series on critical appraisal. In Part 3, we will discuss the process for appraising single study evidence. In this lecture, we will focus on appraising the quality of quantitative single study evidence. Following this lecture, students should be able to describe the purpose and use of quantitative studies, explain how to use Appendix E2 to appraise the quality of quantitative single study evidence, and evaluate the quality of a quantitative study. Let's begin with a review of design and level of support for single study evidence. All single study evidence should have a formal study design. The study design guides the level of support for decision making. We can use the decision tree in Section 1 of Appendix E2 from the Johns Hopkins Model and Guidelines 5th edition to help us determine the study design and level of support for decision making. The design is based on whether or not there was manipulation of an independent variable, and if so, if the study had both a control group and an intervention group. Studies with manipulation and a control group, regardless of randomization, provide strong support for decision making because they can establish causal relationships. Studies with manipulation of an independent variable but no control group, or studies that do not have manipulation of an independent variable, provide moderate support for decision making because they can establish correlational but not causal relationships. Study designs can be either quantitative, qualitative, or mixed methods, and it is the methodology of the study that guides which quality appraisal should be completed. If you recall from Lecture 3A, I indicated that critical appraisal of single study evidence involves two action items. We discussed design and level of support for decision making, which was action item 1 in Lecture 3A. We will now address action item 2, quality, with the focus on quantitative single study evidence. Remember, all single study evidence must be appraised for quality before it can be used to guide practice change. Let's start with a brief review of what is quantitative single study evidence. Quantitative evidence generates scientific data from numbers. Quantitative evidence can have either an interventional design, such as in controlled trials or intervention studies without control or randomization, or an observational design, such as observational analytic or observational descriptive. Quantitative studies that are controlled trials provide strong support for decision making because they can establish causal relationships. Quantitative studies that are either interventional without control or randomization or are observational designs provide moderate support for decision making because they can establish correlational but not causal relationships. On this slide, I have copied the part of the single study evidence appraisal tool in Appendix E2 from the Johns Hopkins Evidence-Based Practice model that addresses quantitative evidence. This quality appraisal tool is looking at if the quantitative study is valid, relevant, and applicable to a specific context. In order to appraise this, we must look at the reliability of the study to ensure the study findings are not merely the results of opinion and/or flawed research. In order to appraise this, we must appraise each section of the study. Over the next few slides, we will break down this appraisal tool by section and then review each quantitative study quality appraisal question in detail, working through exactly what the question is asking so you best know how to answer the questions and provide rationale for how you came to the conclusions you reached. Remember, appraising for quality is a subjective process, but using standardized tools helps to streamline the process. The background and introduction of a quantitative study should serve as a roadmap for the study by providing context, establishing the research problem, and justifying the study's importance. There are two quality appraisal questions related to the background and introduction. The first quality appraisal question for the background and introduction of a quantitative study asks, is a logical background and rationale for the study explained using current literature? To appraise this question, we must consider two aspects. First, is the background and rationale for the study explained logically? Do the authors clearly explain why and how the topic of interest is important? Do they make a strong case not only for why the study was conducted, but why studying this specific topic was necessary and important, and how studying this topic will fill a gap and further the body of evidence. Second, do the authors use current literature to support their rationale for the need for the study? When we are assessing for current literature, we must always go back to the question of if the topic is static or evolving. Remember, if a topic is static, the use of seminal works or older literature is reasonable. For evolving topics, older literature will not provide strong or logical rationale to support the study. The second quality appraisal question for the background and introduction of a quantitative study asks, is the purpose/objective of the study clear? The purpose of the study is a statement of the broad rationale for why the study is being conducted. Think of the purpose as the why for the study. The study objective is more focused than the purpose and should identify the concrete action steps that must be taken to achieve the purpose. Think of the objectives as the what will be done in the study. When appraising the clarity of the purpose, you should ask yourself if the purpose statement used specific and precise language to define the intent of the research through identifying the variables that would be measured, as well as the relationships that the study would investigate. When appraising the clarity of the study objectives, assess that each objective is specific, measurable, achievable, and relevant to the study purpose. The methods section of a quantitative study should describe how the study was conducted in a manner that the reader can evaluate the rigor and validity of the study and that other researchers could replicate the study. There are 12 quality appraisal questions related to methods. The first quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, is the study design clearly stated? The study design is the specific approach or methods and procedures that were used to collect and analyze information. A clearly stated study design should be explicit and formal and should meet the following criteria. It should be planned prior to the investigators initiating any interventions or data collections. It should have received ethical review by an institutional review board. It should use formal and systematic methods to collect and analyze the quantitative data for the purposes of the investigation. The study team should not be subjects of the investigation. The study should include a clear aim, reproducible methods, results, and discussion, and the study should not be based solely on anecdotal evidence, such as the author's personal, organizational, or literature-based experiences. The second quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, is the study setting clearly described, including location, dates, and other important details to enhance generalizability? The study setting is the physical location where the study occurred, as well as the time period in which the study was conducted. The study setting should provide information about the environment in which the study took place, such as the type and size of facility, the geographic location, and any other details specific to the setting that may impact the ability for the study to be reproduced. As a note, it is common, as well as appropriate, for authors to not use the name of the organization where the study occurred, but rather provide general descriptors of the geographical location and type and size of the facility. The information provided about the study setting should provide enough detail that readers and other researchers can determine if the study is generalizable to or applicable in their setting. Generalizability refers to the extent to which the findings from a study can be applied or extended beyond the specific conditions of the study setting. Without a clearly described study setting, generalizability cannot be determined. The third quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, is the process for recruiting participants, sampling, explained clearly, and does it match with the study aim or aims? We discussed sampling in detail in Module 2. You should recall that sampling can be random, convenient, or purposive. The authors of the study should clearly state and describe the sampling method and process that was used, as well as the inclusion and exclusion criteria used to determine participant eligibility. Common methods you will see referred to simple random samples, convenience samples, systematic samples, and cluster samples. If the authors are working with a population that is hard to access or rare disease or condition, snowball sampling would be appropriate. Ultimately, the sampling method used should align with the study's aims. The study's aims are the goals that the study is designed to achieve in order to fulfill the study purpose. If the study is looking to make broad generalizations, then a random sample from a large population is necessary. If the study is a smaller scale pilot study or unit level quality improvement project, a convenience sample would be appropriate. The fourth quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, do eligibility criteria, rules for who can join the study, make sense and are they easy to understand? Another word for eligibility criteria would be inclusion and exclusion criteria. Eligibility criteria is a predetermined list of criteria that outlines the characteristics of who will and who will not be included in a study. The eligibility criteria should be clearly stated in the study, meaning that the criteria define the exact characteristics of who can and cannot be included in the study. Eligibility criteria may be based on feasibility, but should also be based on what is ethical and who or what the investigators are truly trying to study. When appraising that eligibility criteria make sense and are easy to understand, you should refer back to the study purpose and objectives and consider if the eligibility criteria directly relate to the target population. An easy way to appraise this is to ask yourself if the inclusion criteria make sense, or if they should be narrowed to control for confounding variables or factors. You should also consider if the exclusion criteria remove those participants and factors that may otherwise compromise the measurement of the outcome under the investigation or interfere with study results. An easy way to appraise this is to ask yourself if the exclusion criteria are justified based on the study purpose and objectives. The fifth quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, is the sample size powered adequately? A calculation or other explanation for how the authors decided how many participants or observations to include. We discussed power back in Module 3 when we talked about hypothesis testing. You should recall from Module 3 that a priori power analysis is a power analysis that is done before the study is performed and provides you information on the minimum sample size needed to be able to confidently and correctly reject the null hypothesis. You should always perform a priori power analysis. An ad hoc power analysis is a power analysis that is performed after the study is completed and lets you know how much power the study had based on the sample size. This is not good planning and really should not be done in research. When appraising quantitative research, you should always look to see if a power analysis was performed and then compare the sample size to the size required based on the power analysis. If a power analysis was not performed, you want to look for rationale as to why one was not done and how the investigators decided how many participants to include in the study. For smaller studies, such as pilot studies and unit-level quality improvement projects, you may not find a power analysis because the sample is inherently small. In these cases, often the sample was everyone on the unit or department during the time of the study who agreed to participate. The sixth quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, did the authors clearly state what they wanted to measure? This appraisal question is essentially asking if the authors provided both a conceptual and operational definition for their variables of interest. Remember, a variable is any characteristic, number, or quantity that can be measured or quantified and should link directly to the aims of the study. A conceptual definition is a dictionary definition of the theoretical meaning of the variable of interest. Conceptual definitions provide a foundational understanding of the concept of interest. For example, if you're going to measure stress, you need to conceptually define what stress is as a phenomena. An operational definition explains how the concept or variable will be measured or observed in the study. An operational definition may include the use of a specific tool or process. Only together do conceptual and operational definitions provide a clear picture of what the investigators want to measure. The seventh quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, are data collection methods clear and appropriate? This includes how they gathered and recorded the information. The data collection method is the formal process for gathering information for analysis. Data should be collected in a systematic, objective, and repeatable manner. A clearly described data collection method includes details of any tools used, how the data were recorded, i.e. were data recorded electronically or using paper surveys, and where data were collated and stored for future analysis. Data collection tools are any instruments that are used to gather data. All tools used in data collection should be described. A clear description includes the number and type of questions asked in a tool, as well as the specific metrics gathered. In some instances, the authors may provide a copy of the data collection tool as an appendix to the printed article. To appraise the appropriateness of data collection methods, consider if the data collection methods align with the research goals, sample size, and with ethical guidelines. And now is where the quantitative portion of Section 2 of Appendix E2 gets a bit wonky. I would not be surprised if in the near future an amendment to this appendix comes out. I say things get wonky because the appraisal questions seem out of order. For example, question 8b falls under tools, but is not about tools, but rather about the methods used to analyze data. For this reason, I will tell you which number each question is as I discuss them, but I'm going to discuss the questions in an order that would make more sense if you were actually appraising a single study quantitative article. So, all that being said, let's look at question 8. The eighth quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, if applicable, were all the tools reliable? Notice this question starts out, if applicable. If the investigators did not use any tools, then you can check not applicable. If the investigators used tools, you need to check if they provided any information that speaks to the reliability of the tools. Remember, reliability means that the tool will yield the same results under consistent conditions across different times and settings. The most common way that you will see reliability expressed is with the Cronbach's alpha statistic. If the authors provide a Cronbach's alpha for reliability, you want to assess if the number is equal to or greater than 0.7. Other ways that the authors may speak to reliability would be noting confirming inter-rater reliability, which means the tool provided consistent measurements regardless of who was collecting and analyzing the data, or test-retest reliability, which means the tool provided consistent measurements across multiple tests with unchanged conditions. Ultimately, though, the Cronbach's alpha is really the gold standard for documenting that a tool is reliable. Quality appraisal question 8a in the methods section of a quantitative study asks, if applicable, were all the tools valid? Again, notice this question starts out with the phrase, if applicable. If the investigators did not use any tools, then you can check not applicable. If the investigators used tools, you need to check if the authors provided any information that speaks to the validity of the tools. Recall that validity means the tools measure what they intended to measure. There are three main types of validity that may be discussed to demonstrate that a tool is valid. We went over these in detail in Module 2 when we discussed the foundational concepts of statistics, but I will review each briefly here. Content validity means the tool measures all of the aspects of the concept of interest. Criterion validity means the tool has been compared to a standard or benchmark and provides closely related results. Construct validity means the individual questions or items within the tool correlate to the construct we want to measure. You may also see face validity listed as a form of validity. Face validity is the weakest form of validity and simply means the tool appears to measure what it says it measures. I would caution you against accepting a tool as valid if the only discussion of validity provided is face validity. We are now going to jump forward and look at question number 9. Quality appraisal question 9 in the methods section of a quantitative single study asks, if applicable, are the interventions clearly described? Once again, this question starts out with the phrase, if applicable. If the study was observational, then you should check the box for not applicable. Remember, not all studies have an intervention. If the study was interventional, then you need to appraise the clarity of the intervention. Remember, the intervention is what the researchers did, or in other words, how the researchers manipulated the independent variable. When appraising the clarity of the intervention, consider how well the researchers described their process. A clearly described intervention should be precise enough that it could be completely replicated. We are now going to look at question number 10 and question number 11 together because question 10 is more of a header to lead into question 11. Quality appraisal question 10 in the methods section of a quantitative single study is not actually a question, but rather a phrase that states, if there was randomization. Question 11 follows this and asks, was true randomization used to put people into the control and intervention groups? To respond to question 10, look at if the study includes randomization. Remember, randomization means when assigning participants to group, all participants have equal chance of being assigned to any group. If the study does not include randomization, you can mark both questions 10 and 11 as not applicable. If the study does include randomization, mark question 10 yes and proceed to appraising question 11. Question 11 is focused on true randomization. True randomization means that participants were assigned to the intervention or control group based on chance, and therefore bias is minimized. To appraise if true randomization was used, you want to look at the description of the randomization process. Methods such as random number generators or coin flips are examples of true randomization. Using convenience methods to separate participants, such as splitting a group in half, or putting all morning participants in one group and afternoon participants in another group, is not true randomization. Next, we will look at question 11a. Quality appraisal question 11a in the methods section of a quantitative study asks, other than the intervention being studied, were the intervention and control groups treated similarly? Well, this question does not start with the phrase, if applicable. This question is only applicable if the study is a control trial, because the question is asking about the control group. This question is applicable to both control trials with and without randomization. If the study is not a control trial, mark this question as not applicable and move on. If the study has an intervention group and a control group, you need to look at how the groups were treated. Having a control group does not mean the control group received no treatment. Rather, the control group should receive some form of similar but non-intervention care. Often, this would be the standard of care or a placebo intervention. Standards of care and placebo interventions are used intentionally to control for things such as time spent with a member of the study team or the expectation of a positive result. Other considerations when appraising similar treatment are if both the intervention and control group received equal follow-up and the outcomes being assessed were measured in the same way for both the intervention and control groups. We will now return to question 8b. Quality appraisal question 8b in the methods section of a quantitative study asks, are the methods to analyze the data well explained? This includes what computer programs they use, how they made calculations, or anything else they did to explore the data. This question is asking us to appraise the data analysis methods used in the quantitative study. Data analysis is the systematic process used to describe, summarize, and evaluate the data for the purposes of creating greater meaning from the data. When appraising the data analysis methods in quantitative studies, you should look for the authors to specifically state the software that was used to aid analysis. Often, this software will be Microsoft Excel or IBM SPSS. If SPSS is used, you should also look for the authors to state which version of SPSS was used. Furthermore, you should look for what statistical calculations were used and then confirm if these statistical calculations and the chosen statistical tests align with the research question and type of data collected. This means you will need to apply what you learned in Module 3 about statistical analysis. Next, we are going to jump forward to question 11b. Quality appraisal question 11b in the methods section for a quantitative study asks, is there information on the ethical review provided? Ethical review means that an institutional review board, IRB, assessed the research proposal to ensure that it was ethically acceptable. All research studies conducted in the United States should undergo ethical review. There are some international exceptions to ethical review based on the country in which a study was conducted and the amount of interactions with participants. That being said, citing the ethical review process is an essential component of a research study and should be explicitly stated. The author should explicitly state that the study went through an ethical review as well as indicate if the study was deemed approved or exempt. Approved means the study was deemed to have met ethical guidelines, and exempt means the study was found to have minimal risk and was not required to go through a full review process. If no ethical review is noted, the ethics of the study should be viewed with a high level of scrutiny. We will now look at question 12. The 12th and final quality appraisal question for the methods section of a quantitative study asks, in addition to the items above, did the authors answer all of your questions about how they conducted your study? Include notes about any additional concerns. To best answer this question, consider how well you understand the specific steps the investigators took to conduct the study. Ask yourself if you feel like you could repeat the study based on the information the authors provided. If your answer is no, jot down what questions you still have or what was unclear about their process. You may not have any questions. You may have a lot of questions. Do not expect that if you check yes, that later you will remember what questions you had. Jot your questions down now. The results and findings section of a quantitative study should objectively report the main outcomes of the data analysis without interpretation. Key findings should be presented in a logical order using a combination of written text, tables, and figures to answer the research questions posed in the introduction. The focus should be on presenting the data as it is, which then will provide evidence for the discussion section that follows. There are 7 quality appraisal questions related to results and findings. The first quality appraisal question for the results and findings section of a quantitative study asks, do the findings make sense and are they easy to understand? Remember, findings are the outcomes of the data analysis without interpretation. To appraise if the finding makes sense, go back and look at the research question. Do the findings directly relate to the research question? To appraise if the findings are easy to understand, consider if the findings are presented logically and if the authors included supporting data and visualization such as graphs, charts, or tables. The second quality appraisal question for the results and findings section of a quantitative study asks, are the characteristics of participants provided? This may include demographics or other important details about the participants or things being studied. Participants are the individuals taking part in the study. Researchers should include enough information about participants so that the readers can easily understand who the study findings could be applied to. Common demographic characteristics to include are age and gender. Other characteristics should be included as they relate to the study focus. Some common examples may be years of experience, highest level of education, or years working on a specific unit. The third quality appraisal question for the results and findings section of a quantitative study asks, if applicable, was the survey response rate provided? This is another question that starts with the phrase, if applicable. If a survey was not used, you will not have a survey response rate, and thus you can simply mark the question as non-applicable. If a survey was used, you must appraise this question. The survey response rate is often presented as a percentage and refers to how many individuals responded out of all those invited to complete the survey. When reporting survey response rates, the author should state the exact number of people that they invited to participate in the study. Note, this question is not asking you about the adequacy of the survey response rate, but merely that the response rate was reported. If the response rate was low, this is something you should look to be addressed in the discussion section of the article when we discuss limitations, and we will get to this later on in our appraisal. The fourth quality appraisal question for the results and findings section of a quantitative study asks, if applicable, are attrition rates provided? This includes how many people remained with the study at each stage. This is another question that starts with the phrase, if applicable. The attrition rate is the number of participants who dropped out at any point during the course of the study. We care about attrition rates because they can affect the validity and reliability of study outcomes. If no participants were lost during the study, you would technically have an attrition rate of 0. The researchers should still indicate this. If any participants were lost to attrition, the researchers should report this as either a raw number or a percentage. Note that similar to the response rate question, this question is not asking about how attrition impacted the study, but merely that the attrition rate was reported. If the attrition rate is high, this is something you should be looked to be addressed in the limitations part of the discussion section of the article. And again, we will come back to this later in the appraisal process. The fifth quality appraisal question for the results and findings section of a quantitative study asks, is data provided for each item the author stated they wanted to measure? Variables is the term for the items that are being measured in research and evidence-based practice. Thus, to answer this question, we need to review if the authors provided data for all of the variables of interest. The most efficient method to do this is go back to the study purpose and research question. Remember that within the study's purpose, the authors should indicate all the variables they intend to measure. You should also be able to identify these variables within the research question. The study purpose and research question should also provide insight onto how the researchers intended to measure the variables. Once you have this information, you can return to the results and findings section and look for each variable to be addressed and specific data to be reported. The sixth quality appraisal question for the results and findings section of a quantitative study asks, if applicable, are the baseline characteristics of the intervention and control group similar? Once again, we have a question that starts with the phrase, if applicable. If you do not have a control trial, answer this question not applicable because this question is asking specifically about intervention and control groups. If you do have a control trial, you want to make sure that the control group is similar to the intervention group in all ways possible except for the intervention. One method of appraising this is to ensure that baseline characteristics of the intervention and control groups are similar. Baseline characteristics are the descriptive data collected from participants before a research study's intervention begins and allow researchers to confirm that the intervention and control groups are comparable. Baseline characteristics that should be collected and reported include demographic data, any medical and/or health information that is relevant to the study, as well as any other study-specific measurements. The seventh and final quality appraisal question for the results and findings section of a quantitative study asks, are any statistics shown clearly? Remember, statistics is a practical method for collecting, organizing, summarizing, and presenting data. Any statistics that are presented should relate directly back to the original study question. When reporting statistics to enhance clarity, the researchers should follow a consistent format. The clear presentation of statistics also requires that both descriptive and inferential statistics be presented. At a minimum, measures of central tendency, p-values, confidence intervals, and effect sizes should be reported for all outcomes measured. The discussion section of a quantitative study should analyze the study results and findings and explain their significance by addressing the results in the context of the research question, as well as connecting results to existing literature. Strengths and weaknesses of the study should be addressed in this section, as well as any alternative explanations for study findings. Theoretical and practical implications of the results, such as suggestions for the direction of future research, should be addressed in the discussion section. There are 4 quality appraisal questions related to discussion. These questions may sound familiar to you, and they should, as they are the exact same 4 appraisal questions as were in the discussion section of systematic literature reviews. The first quality appraisal question for the discussion section of a quantitative study asks, does the discussion match what is reported in the results section? Remember, the purpose of the discussion section is to provide an analysis of the findings and explain how the findings from the quantitative study compare to the current state of evidence. This appraisal question is focused on the analysis of findings part of the definition of discussion. When appraising if the discussion matches what is reported in the results section, you are looking for a clear transition and flow from the results to the discussion. In other words, the discussion should be consistent with the findings presented in the results section. You want to ensure that the discussion does not make any overstated claims or misinterpret the results. You also want to ensure that all important outcomes were addressed in the discussion, even those outcomes that may not be consistent with previous research or support what you were hoping to find. The second quality appraisal question for the discussion section of a quantitative study asks, do the authors examine what they found and compare it to other literature on the topic? Remember, the purpose of the discussion section is to provide an analysis of the findings and explain how the findings from the quantitative study compare to the current state of the evidence. This appraisal question is focused on the comparison to current evidence part of the definition of discussion. Comparing study findings to existing literature is a crucial component of high-quality evidence. Comparing findings helps establish credibility by showing how new results align with or diverge from previous work. Comparing findings also reveals broader trends and helps guide future research by highlighting areas that are well understood and those that need further exploration. When appraising if the authors compared their findings to other literature on the topic, you want to ensure that they are again comparing apples to apples. Is the other literature on the same topic and investigating the same outcomes? How recent was the other literature? Remember, this is especially critical for evolving topics. The third quality appraisal question for the discussion section of a quantitative study asks, are limitations included with an explanation of how they were handled? Limitations are the recognized flaws, constraints, or weaknesses within a study that may affect the results or implications of the findings. It is important to remember that all studies have limitations. If the limitations of the study are not addressed, then this in and of itself is a limitation. Some common examples of limitations specifically for quantitative studies include the inability to control the study environment or control for all potential confounding variables, a small sample size, a low survey response rate, a high attrition rate, the risk for response bias, and the oversimplification of complex human experiences depending on the tools used. These are just a sampling of possible limitations to give you an idea of what might be addressed here. When you are appraising for limitations, you want to look at if the authors identified limitations as well as how they mitigated limitations. You should also consider if there were any significant limitations that you picked up when reading the study that the authors did not address. The fourth and final quality appraisal question for the discussion section of a quantitative study asks, Do the authors provide implications of their study for practice and future investigation? Implications of the study answers the simple question of what's next or where do we go from here? Implications are important because implications clearly and explicitly take your hard work from the raw data of your findings to showing how your findings contribute to the overall body of knowledge on the topic. Implications clarify the significance and impact of your findings. When appraising implications, you want to appraise not only if implications are presented, but if they make sense based on the study findings. If the findings were not significant, but yet the authors suggest robust practice change, this should be a red flag. Do the future investigations that the authors recommend relate to the project that was conducted? Can you see how the project led to suggestions for further investigation? The quality appraisal of quantitative studies ends with two general appraisal questions to specifically address the consistency of the study and the minimization of bias. Again, these questions are very similar to the two general questions posed in the systematic literature review quality appraisal. The first quality appraisal question under the heading of General when appraising a quantitative study asks, is all the information in the paper congruent, consistent throughout the aims, methods, results, and discussion sections? This appraisal question basically defined congruent, but another way of thinking about congruent is that all the components have a logical fit or alignment with each other. Congruency must be presented throughout the entire research process. When appraising congruency, you want to specifically focus on the aims and the methods. Do the methods described logically lead to answering the research question or achieving the aims? Then look at the methods and results. Do the results directly correspond to the measurements and analyses described in the methods? Then look at the results and discussion. Do the interpretations and conclusions in the discussion section accurately reflect the data presented in the results? The discussion should not make claims that are not supported by the results. It is important to identify any inferences as such and to avoid the overstating of findings. The second quality appraisal question under the heading of General when appraising a quantitative study, which is also the final quality appraisal question for quantitative studies before we hit a yellow box, asks, are fundings and conflicts of interest addressed? Fundings involve who provided financial support for the project. Funding should be addressed to ensure transparency, accountability, and ethical compliance. The transparent addressing of fundings helps those appraising the evidence to evaluate the credibility of the findings, as funding sources can influence research questions asked as well as introduce bias. Funding should be clearly acknowledged, usually as a sidebar at the beginning or end of a research article. Addressing ending fundings or stating there were no organized fundings is often a requirement for peer-reviewed literature. No indication of funding should cause one to question the credibility of the study. Disclosure of fundings is one way to assess for conflicts of interest. Conflicts of interest involve any interests that have the potential to compromise the project. These could be personal or financial and have the potential of compromising the investigator's professional judgment and objectivity in the design, conduction, or reporting of study findings. While having a conflict of interest, such as being employed by the company that is supporting the project, is not in and of itself unethical, failing to disclose conflicts of interest or failing to address how one managed conflicts of interest in an ethical manner can also damage the credibility of the project. After answering the two general appraisal questions, we come to a yellow box. As I have discussed previously, a yellow box in the Johns Hopkins appraisal tools usually indicates an action item. This yellow box directs us to consider all of your responses above. Do you think the quality of this article is adequate to provide dependable information to answer your evidence-based practice question? Now, the natural question is generally how many yeses or how many nos within the appraisal process make an article adequate quality. I addressed this briefly in the Part 1 lecture, and the short answer is that no predetermined number of yes or no responses determine quality. However, I'm going to discuss with you some considerations to help you interpret the appraisal and reach a logical and rational conclusion regarding the quality of the study. When determining the quality of a quantitative study, here are some things to think about. If, and this is rare, if every question for the quantitative quality appraisal was answered with yes or not applicable, then the quality of the study is adequate to provide dependable information to answer your evidence-based practice question. If any quality appraisal questions were answered no or unclear, go back and review those questions. Consider how the answers of no or unclear may have impacted the study results and findings. I suggest you jot down notes during this process. Specifically consider if any of the individual no's or unclears or any combination of no's and unclears was enough to make you question the accuracy of the findings. If the answer is yes, then the piece of evidence is not adequate to provide dependable information to answer your evidence-based practice question. Determining adequate quality is a subjective decision that you need to be able to make and support for yourself based on your critical quality appraisal of the piece of evidence. Remember that once you critically appraise the evidence, it is best practice to use an independent double-check system, which means having another member of your team independently review the evidence and compare your answers for individual questions as well as your conclusions regarding quality adequacy. Ultimately, your team should make a decision based on if the piece of evidence should be included as support for practice change, or if the piece of evidence is too flawed to provide support for practice change and should thus be excluded. If you deem the piece of evidence too flawed and thus not of adequate quality, check the little no box within the yellow box. Remember to make yourself notes on why the article was not of adequate quality and move the article to a folder, either a literal folder or a folder on your computer, where you are going to store excluded articles. I caution you not to throw away articles so that you can still refer back to your appraisal and rationale at a later date and time. If you deem the piece of evidence adequate quality, check the little yes box and look back at your level of support for decision making to determine if the article provides strong or moderate support. I would suggest making a note of this so that you can remember whether the article was strong or moderate support for future reference. Notice that following checking the yes box, you have instructions to complete the data collection table on page 1. Let's talk about that table. I have a copy of the data collection table provided for you on this slide. Taking the time to complete the data collection table after appraising the piece of evidence is worth your effort. Immediately following your critical appraisal of the article, you're going to be intimately familiar with the article, so completing the table at this point in time will be simple. Furthermore, this table is a cutout of a row from Appendix G2, the individual evidence summary tool, which you will need to complete as you prepare for the synthesis step of the evidence-based practice process. Congratulations, you have now learned all the steps to critically appraise the quality of a piece of quantitative single study evidence. To recap what we have discussed with the critical appraisal of quantitative single study evidence, you should first begin by determining the study design and level of support for decision making using the decision tree from Section 1 of Appendix E2. Next, proceed to the quality appraisal using the quantitative quality appraisal tool in Section 2 of Appendix E2. If the quality of the quantitative study is adequate to provide dependable information to answer your evidence-based practice question, go back to the first page of Appendix E2 and complete the data collection table. Your future self will thank you when you begin to synthesize the evidence. We will continue our discussion of appraising single study evidence in Module 6. Stay tuned.